Amber, it always looks like you're there, but you're not. Hey there.
Hi. She has a very convincing picture.
Doesn't she? She's about to talk. Yeah. You got your hair cut.
I did.
Yeah, it's cute.
Thank you. Thank you. I've had short hair before. And I, every once in a while I'll just get antsy and want short hair again. And my hair grows really fast. So it's like very low risk,
Good.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm glad your hair grows fast, and then you get to change your hair when it feels like you're called to do it, and you can do it often.
Yes.
Yes. So welcome everybody. So just to do some administrative work. So for next week, which is All Saints Day, it's a big church. It's our title feast at my church at All Saints, and we have quite the time. So anybody who wants to come and experience it would be welcome. We have a procession. We name every saint you can think of. Kierkegaard will definitely be named. Where's Jared? He's not. He should, and actually Jared's a member there. So I wonder if he forgot about us. Anyway, so, and then in addition to it being All Saints Day, we're going to be talking about Christology, and we'll be reading Park's book on Christology. And I think you'll find that interesting and helpful. We'll also be taking a look at, let me see what the syllabus actually says, because, I shouldn't just rely on my memory completely. Oh, yes. So I'm asking you also what your favorite saint might be. And what do I have? Oh, that's Clark's. So is that Clark's? Oh, yes. And so we're having those short presentations next time. And I encourage you to go ahead and read Clark, even if you aren't presenting on him. I'm assuming everybody's going to read these, all of them. Here, let me show you. Is this it? So here's Clark's work here. I mean, it's copied for you. This is just an article actually he wrote. I think it did get published in Disciples World, but it was also something he just used in his Sunday school class or an adult education kind of engagement at Central Christian back in the day. So are there any questions about this, by the way? What I'm inviting you to do? Okay. Then we've got a couple interviews with Dr. Park, which I think are really helpful in engaging, helping to understand what he's saying. But I think his book is fairly easy to read. That's my favorite saint, who hasn't been canonized yet. And then we will move to the triune view of salvation and redemption, and either Zach and Grace. Is it Grace? It's not Grace. Grace is already done. Grace, did you already do your discussion starter?
No, I was going to go earlier, but then someone wanted to switch. And
okay.
So,
okay.
yeah, I switched to then because Zach and I are in different groups.
Oh, okay. I see. Yes. So, but I think Dee Dee is scheduled to do that as well, but I'll have to talk with her and figure out how that works, because then you'd have two different groups. Zach, is Dee Dee in your group?
Dee
No,
Dee's
she's in Grace's group. Okay.
No, but I think Zach might have jury duty that day,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. And so Amber would take over if that's the case. Correct, Amber?
Yes.
Yes. And I encourage you, so this is for in 2 weeks. So this is also This, I don't know if you've taken a look at this, but this is a little worksheet that I created. And it has, it asks you to, it looks at the Nicene Creed. So for example, it looks at, I believe in Jesus the Christ, his only son, our Lord. And so that's asking you or thinking about what's the relationship between Jesus and God the Father. And so then in this section, I'm asking you to take a look at what Williamson or Park or Cone say about that, and then your own construction, right? So this is kind of a how to construct the Christological portion of the creed for yourself. And it's just interesting, I think, to reflect upon how the different theologians, what they have to say about these different questions that the creed is answering. The relationship to the world, is Jesus divine? How does that impact his work with us? What is Jesus's relationship to empire? What's his relationship to death and suffering? What's his relationship to the future? So I'm encourage you to check that out in 2 weeks.
So Dr. Russell, are you asking for this worksheet to be handed in, or just our informal writing as a normal Word document?
Yeah, just you can just use it yourself. I mean, we might take a few moments to reflect upon it, or we might eventually it will be part of the final paper for this course, right? Eventually, not the worksheet, but the result.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Any other questions? All right, great. So we're going to continue talking about Suchocki, and I hope all of you received both my outline of the material for mostly the second part of the book, but really in the nice little summary of the beginning of it as well. And Sarah's excellent summary of the book and her questions. We will be doing that in the second half of the class, discussion starter as per usual. So let's go ahead and begin. Let me see where my notes are. Here we go. All right, did everybody see that? Did everyone get my notes that I posted on the Populi? I assume that means yes, since nobody said anything. So I'm going to remind you about, from last time, Suchocki's discussion about the horizontal transcendence. So instead of thinking of transcendence as only, God is transcendent and Christ engages us to be transcendent, or engages us, helps us to transcend any situation that we're in that gets us stuck, or thinking about transcendence as Niebuhr thinks about it, in terms of we are made up of, Kierkegaard came up with it first, but we're made up of elements that, and Kierkegaard I'm sure wasn't the first one to think of it, but we're made up of understanding this connection that Augustine talks about of the soul and the body as an element or dynamism or power of transcending the situation, transcending the moment, transcending where we are in space, not like floating above it, but being able to reflect upon, I've been in other places, this is Suchocki, but for Niebuhr, the transcendence is vertical. So it has to do with connecting with a divine part, or connecting with I'm going to be better than I am. And I'm going to be able to do that with God. For Suchocki, she wants us to think about transcendence as a horizontal transcendence. So it's not just about being taken out of your body, but rather engaging the body, so that transcendence is memory. I can remember that I've been in a situation like this similarly. It was slightly different in X, Y, and Z ways. And what did I do in that situation, and how did it come out? I also can have memories of that have been written down that aren't my particular individual memories, but are memories from other people that have, that we all often think of as the tradition. How has the tradition thought about this question or issue? And then also a transcendence of empathy. So I can think about or feel how one might respond to a similar situation that someone else is in. And I can have empathy for that person. I can either using my own past feelings or knowing what I know about them, because they might not have the same feelings that I have. I know that probably in your personal relationships, you have this experience as well, where something happens and you might respond in X, Y, and Z way, but the boyfriend or the wife is going to respond in a different way. So having empathy, seeing things from another person's perspective with their sensibility as well. And then imagination, which it really is imagining how things could be different, imagining what it would be like if a world existed, or we could engage in a world where people related to each other without a lot of baggage, or when we didn't have other limitations or COVID or other things that keep us from being present with each other and not harming each other. So those are her foundational understandings of transcendence. And you notice that there's a time reference. So memory has to do with the past, empathy has to do with the present, imagination has to do with the future. And then we also talked a little bit about her notion, her criteria of well-being, inclusive well-being, which she gets from, that's an interpretive analysis of shalom, and engages Julian of Norwich's understanding of a spiritual prayer, all shall be well, all manner of things shall be well. That inclusive well-being indicates to Marjorie, it's a way of shorthand, a way of her saying, this is God's connection with each and every actual entity, which includes both a vision of the future and a call or lure toward that future, in which all is well and all are well. Suchocki sees this as the transformation toward universal well-being, and the criteria for universal well-being are truth, love, and beauty. And truth is about God's judgment. God knows everything at every moment, and God makes a judgment about everything. It's not a judgment of, oh, I pronounce you bad, right? It's more of a judgment of, this is helpful, this is going to move you and others around you and those you're affecting and engaging with toward greater well-being or not. And so God's judgment and truth has to do with knowing you intimately as well. It often is about, one can understand that also in terms of memory. God doesn't have memory because, like us, right? Our memories are inadequate. Sometimes we remember things that we've heard it said so many times that X, Y, and Z was the case, but in fact, it wasn't that. And particularly stories that we might hear from our parents when we're kids about how something happened, probably is more like it's just embellished story. But God's judgment remembers everything, or God's understanding of truth. The way that truth is expressed in terms of God's terms is perfect memory of the past. Or
I had a question about that, Dr. Russell, if
Yeah.
you could clarify. In that section, she says that God doesn't have a past because the past is within God.
Yeah.
And so I just was that surprised me, because I thought that like within open and relational theologies, God must operate within time, like the future. The future is not in God, the future is actually open.
Yeah.
So can you clarify that? Is the past different? Is like the past does that make sense? Like, is God operating within time, except only as it relates to the future? Or is God operating within time and God does have a past? Because she says God doesn't have a past like we do.
Well, God doesn't have a past because God has all the past.
Oh, I
And
didn't
I'm not-
understand. I didn't read it that way. So that's
Well, I mean, it's a good question so I'm going to ask you to hold that question and to ask it later if you can, because I think it is a little confusing. We definitely have pasts, and our pasts are shaped by how we are able to perceive what is occurring at the time, and then also by our memory of it. God's engagement with what we experience as past is actually very different, because God is experiencing everybody, everything, not just from our perspective, and our perspectives are limited. So it's like God's engagement with the past is ongoing, if that makes sense. Yeah, okay, we can talk about it some more later. Yes. But thanks for raising that, because that's an interesting point that she makes. God's also, the criteria of well-being is about love. God's love is an acceptance. It occurs, excuse me, for each of us, each entity, with the fullest knowledge possible, right? With his fullest knowledge of who we are and what we are capable of. God still loves us and loves all entities and accepts us. And then beauty is this criteria understood in God is this integrating harmony that continuously surpasses itself in God's vision for the realm of God, or the realm of God. That's what Dr. Allen says, the realm of God. Sorry. A little water. Okay, I'll have to wait. God has in God, all conflicts are turned into contrasts and toward a harmonious vision or harmonious reality. Violence then is understood as the destruction of any of these criteria. When truth is distorted or destructed or destroyed. When truth is destructed, when love is violated, when beauty is harmed, when beauty is destroyed or not achieved. It's not really that you achieve it, but enabled to be experienced. So now the part two, she goes into violence, because that's her argument, right? Her argument is that instead of naming sin as a relationship that impacts God only, we think about sin as that which impacts others as well. Now, just as an aside, and we can go into this further later, but Suchocki is a Methodist. She's a United Methodist. She has some Episcopalian leanings, but she's not a Calvinist. She's not a Presbyterian. She's not following the Reformed tradition that Niebuhr follows. Rather, she's following the Wesleyan tradition. And for Wesley, sin is much more about how we treat each other. The opposite of sin for Niebuhr, she focuses much on Niebuhr and for Kierkegaard as well. The opposite of sin, it's all about your relationship with God. The opposite of sin then is faith. So those of you who studied some church history know about Luther. The opposite of sin is faith, because it's all about your relationship with God. Wesley does not name it. Wesley thinks that big original sin thing That's been addressed in the prevenient grace. So our sins now are not named explicitly or primarily in terms of God, but rather in terms of not loving our neighbors as ourselves. It's not that he doesn't include not loving God above all things, but he's much more focused on loving the neighbor. And in fact, for him, the opposite of sin is this Christian perfection, not faith. It's not about, it's not limited to one's relationship with God, but rather is about one's relationship with all around you, mostly other people. Because for him, perfection is not like Zach's way of doing math, or I should say Amber's way of doing math, because I don't know if Zach does any math or not, but he's just he's right here next to me. So, but rather perfection is about loving, perfect loving. And so Wesley's view, and I had a conversation with Marjorie over the weekend, and she's like, well, actually it was an email exchange, but she said, that's exactly right. And she hadn't even noticed it. She wrote this a while ago, but that's really where she's coming from. Both the process theology has influenced her, but also Wesley has influenced her, which is not really being named in the book. But so if we think about that as how do we understand sin, the thing that's wrong in the world, as violence, as violation of the well-being of others, rather than, as many of the theologians in the past have named, it's because we're in a state of finitude. And because we're in that state of finitude, we're anxious, and we don't know whether or not we should leap too far toward what God could be, or stay stuck, a little bit like rock climbing. You don't want to leap too far because you're going to fall, but you don't want to just stay there. That's a Niebuhrian way of thinking about sin. Wesley is much more concerned about much less concerned about how you're going to get to the top of the rock and more concerned about how you're helping the people with you. So going back to the text now. So sin, seen as violence or violation. So violation of well-being. And she talks about that in 3 dimensions. I mean, so Suchocki's book here is very organized and systematic in the sense of, here's the issue, there's 3 problems. Here's the way God is, there's 3 ways God is. There's 3 problems about sin, and we're going to name those in relation to our past, our present, and our future. So the sin that comes from our past is this violence that we've inherited in our genes. And it was a violence that we needed in order to survive. Self-centeredness served our ancestors, yet she names, or she highlights the fact that for Schleiermacher, God consciousness replaces this drive. So for Schleiermacher, God consciousness is really important, and it's what makes humans human as opposed to animals. Whereas for animals, the egocentric or the self-centeredness of survival, and again, those of you who watch the Nature Channel might have a different view of who animals actually are, but in the 19th century and the late 18th century, folks had a different way of thinking about animals. But so for Schleiermacher, the God consciousness replaces the natural drive with this ethical sense of responsibility and the notion that we are free and are called to do something with that freedom. Where I put that. We go forward and realize that in order for life to exist, in order for Zach and Amber and Reagan and Chance and Sarah Lynn and even Joel to be as smart as you all are, and others that I didn't mention, you're smart too. I just happened to see people in the Zoom room. We had to eat we, not individually, but as humans, our ancestors had to eat meat. Without eating meat, without having that quantity and quality of protein, our brains would never have developed to be able to have this kind of conversation. That's the going science. So whether it's correct or not is not an issue here. Let's just pretend like it is, even if you don't think it is. So the idea then is that life is robbery. One can note that life is robbery. We have to eat something in order to survive. Now, Ibensfeld, it's a tongue twister. Try doing that without water. Says that human instincts toward the violence and aggression, as well as social bonding, are things that we've inherited from our ancestors. And then notice there's a tension between these two. Like, who are we violent against and who do we socially bond with? So we have aggression ingrained in us because our ancestors that were aggressive towards some and bonded with others were the ones that survived to produce us, to reproduce, to lead to us. So it's a kind of a stubborn fact, as Whitehead would say, a stubborn fact. Process theology's view of sin, this is one of her critiques. So typical process theology says sin is not following God's initial aim. So you recall that we talked about this perhaps last time. Oh, there's lots of chats. You're gonna have to tell me if there's something that I need to know.
Yeah, so Dr. Russell, we were just discussing a related question that Shara had about what time in the future would mean in terms of God experiencing it. So I tried to give kind of my best guess of an answer of how I would think a process theist would respond. And Zach seemed to agree with it. You can look over it quickly if you want to, but it sounds about right, at least from what I've heard.
Okay, well, I will, I will look at it later. What I'd like to do is this. Okay. So you recall when we were talking about process theology and the way that it understands the movement of time, you have the past. And, you know, for Marjorie, these are more like spirals, right? So you take the actual entity, the moment of becoming, takes the past into itself, brings it all together, integrates it in some way, and then moves forward toward the next moment. And God is present in each of these, right? God sins God's initial aim. I shouldn't even say sinned. It's not like it's sent through the mail or something. God communicates God's initial aim to the actual occasion as it's becoming. And if the actual occasion as it's becoming, that would be Sarah Lynn, as you're becoming, if you listen to God's initial aim, then you're not sinning. This is not Suchocki, this is process theology. Suchocki suggests that this is not as a helpful way of thinking about it at all, or not as helpful as her way of thinking about it, which is you may have several different past factors that are coming in to be taken into the present. So now we've moved to this present, right? And the best way to integrate them, there might be one best way, but there might be 4 good ways. And it seems limiting, Suchocki says, that God would pick one and say everything else is a sin, but only the one that God chose is the right one. When in fact, there might be 4 good options. So there might be no good options. I mean, we've talked about Sophie's choice. There's no good option there, right? The only good option, or the worst option is to not choose and lose both. But we can think of another situation. I can think of another situation like, say you're working with youth group and folks are trying to figure out what kinds of classes they want to take in college, or what they want to think about toward their vocation. Well, being a teacher, being a doctor, going into business, those are all, none of them, I mean, choosing one of those does not seem like it, oh, you chose to be a teacher instead of a doctor, so that's a sin. That doesn't make any sense to Suchocki. Rather, there would be things to do that, being a drug dealer, that probably isn't good. That might be sinful, right? But how do you judge it? Because it wasn't the initial aim. She suggests this is a different criteria. We use this criteria of how does it participate in the well-being of others, and does it violate that well-being? So that's the way what she's talking about when she's referring to her critique of process theology, right? So she's saying, she says that it moves sin, which she doesn't think is the case. It moves it into a kind of subconscious or unconscious sphere, and away from an intentional and conscious responsibility as well. So for her, something is, she names sin as that which is conscious and intentional. So when you are violating the well-being of someone else unintentionally, it's not a sin. It doesn't become a sin until you are aware and conscious of it. It still may be harmful. And so you may be, it may be a godly move to move toward becoming conscious of those things. But until you are, this is that catch-22 that she talks about later in the book. Until you are, it's not a sin because you haven't been intentional about it. And she talks about this moment of awakening in youth, where you're aware all of a sudden, because, does the 3-year-old know when it's, I don't know enough about 3-year-olds. Does somebody have a 3-year-old or something, right? So 3-year-olds, if they're hitting the dog because they think it's funny when the dog makes noise like that, is that really a sin? Is that very different than a 15-year-old hitting the dog, right? So see the difference that Suchocki is trying to make clear. And she does that by offering this critique of process theology. She wants to say that instead, the violation, becoming conscious of the violation is the actual transition to actual sin, as opposed to sinning without knowing it. Now, that's the first element of original sin, or inherited sin, the way in which sin is inherited by us, that tendency toward violence. The second one is the fact that we are all interconnected. Now, this, she does follow a lot of the process theology view. We are all interconnected. And she says there's a couple of quotes here that are helpful that you can take a look at. Evil anywhere or everywhere is mediated everywhere through the relational structure of existence. We're all interconnected. So every act of violence is like a stone or a pebble thrown into a pond. It continues, it vibrates out and continues to affect people who have no idea who the heck was the original pebble thrower, or what the original pebble was. And we see this particularly in the way that abuse of young persons, whether they be children or young adults or women. Well, it could be the case for men as well, but particularly we see this in spousal abuse, that the violations spread outward and impact others that you're related to. So Zach may be influenced or impacted negatively by something that simply happens in where he lives because of something that happened 10 miles from where he lives, because that's the relational structure of the world. Then the third dimension is social institutions. So then we're talking about the future, how social institutions continue to impact the world long after the reason for their construction is forgotten, or the original way in which it worked has been cemented, and it doesn't work that way anymore because the situation has changed. Those of you who have worked in any kind of institution and had any administrative responsibilities can see that there's a certain way that people do things. And it's, we probably see this in churches a lot as well. Like, why do we do that? Why do you do it that way? Right? I mean, there's a story about this, and I'm not going to be able to remember it, but that people do things a certain way because originally there was a log there, they had to step over it. But now that everybody steps when they come into the church, they make a big step, and that then has become an institution. They all do that, and then it becomes some sort of violation of the norm if you don't do the big step, even if you are new to the congregation and you don't know what that big step, why are we doing that? And nobody remembers. But this often occurs not in just light ways, but in negative ways that impact people's lives and livelihoods and relationships. Our social inheritance, she says, are particular forms of sin that are embodied in a society's institutions, and usually it's to protect the privileges of a dominant group, because those are the folks that have continued to perpetuate it. And those deeply influence the structures of our consciousness and our very sense of what's right and wrong. Here's where she talks a little bit about how we feel guilty sometimes, but in fact, we aren't actually guilty. And in fact, to be actually guilty might mean to not feel guilty, because you're following the norms of the social institution, which is harming people, or which could be harming people, but you don't feel guilty because those are the norms of the situation. I mean, those are the norms of the institution. Does that make sense? Okay. Then she talks about, she wants us to, she's named those three elements of how sin impacts the world, as she's interpreting or defining sin as violation against the well-being of creation. Then she talks about responses to sin. So now the responses she talks about in terms of sin are about guilt and freedom. So she wants to maintain that we are free, and we are called in that freedom to act in certain ways, which are maybe not limited to one way, but we make our own decisions about that. So it's not just like following the dots or a treasure map, right? We're working it out as we're going. And I think that's one of the things that process theology offers that some of the other theological perspectives don't, as if there's a path that you have to follow, and if you don't take the right way, this place, you won't end up where the gold is. But with process theology, part of the journey is about the decisions that you make, and where you end up. It's not like there's one goal, right? There's places, or there's values that you are wanting to inscribe into the world and into you that you do along the way, and hopefully it will lead to less violation of well-being. So freedom then becomes a very important element in process theology. It's the ability to develop one's own potentiality with intention, with one's own potential intentionally. So does anybody know who Frankl is? Viktor Frankl? Right, so Zach, tell us about Viktor Frankl a little bit.
Oh, I don't know about Viktor Frankl.
Oh, who did you
Yeah.
think I was talking about?
I don't know what the reference.
Oh, I thought you made your hand like that. You had your head.
Oh, sorry, I was responding to somebody.
Oh, all
He
right,
was,
never mind. So nobody knows
He
who
was the
Viktor
author
Frankl
of,
is?
he was the
I'm
author of
familiar.
Man's Search for Meaning, right?
Yes, I think that was Jared, right?
Yeah, sorry, my apologies. I kind of talked over a few people, but yeah, he was the author of Man's Search for Meaning, and only know I mean, he was a psychotherapist, and I only know the broad outline of his life, but he was a Holocaust survivor, and he got the inspiration of that book from, observing his fellow prisoners in the camp, correct? I forgot what his main point was, but yeah, but that's, am I correct? Am I getting on the right?
Yeah. So yes, thank you, Jared. So Frankl finds meaning, and Suchocki highlights it. He finds meaning even in the midst of horrors of the Holocaust and the concentration camps, the terror camps. Even after his wife has been killed and burned in the ovens, he finds that he is able to see, he's able to see the beauty of the sunsets. He's able to see beauty even in this horrible place. And that to him reminds him that he's free. He has freedom, an ability to respond in a way that transcends the norms and expectations of society. Just think about that, reflect upon that freedom is not about, oh, I can move my arms, or I can vote, or I can have influence upon Zach's grade, or I'm trying to make sure Zach's paying attention. But rather freedom is about being able to transcend this expectation of how you're going to respond. Somebody's trying to make you feel horrible, but you have the freedom to notice the sunset. It's profound in the midst of horrible suffering. And nothing to take away from the horrible suffering, but to recognize that was the way, and he also talks about that was the way he was able to survive, to enable meaning, even when meaning is stolen from him. She highlights that as a way of thinking about how we understand freedom. So sin, she says, is how we are participating in ill-being. Guilt is different from sin, right? So you notice how she makes the distinction between guilt and sin. Does everybody understand that distinction she makes? Does anybody want to share that or ask a question about that? I know Sarah knows, Sarah Lynn knows, but anybody else know?
I think I do. So is it like sort of the example you gave of the 3-year-old? It's like they may cause harm in the world, but they don't necessarily have guilt because they don't have knowledge of what it is that they've done.
Yeah, no conscious awareness.
Okay.
So sin is that you are sinning even when you're not consenting to it because you're doing something that's harming someone. But guilt is, in order to be guilty, you have to have consented and to be able to know you could have made a decision that was different and that you should have made a different decision. Like you're able to know right and wrong. People often use that as a reference. I think it's an interesting distinction that she makes, and it's helpful to think about it theologically. But again, as she said, or as I said earlier, this catch-22 often happens where we feel guilty, but we aren't actually guilty, right? We feel guilty, when we transgress a boundary. So one might feel guilty if one does something different than the way it's been done before, or one stands up for one's rights to be treated equally. One would not be guilty though. One would just feel, but one would feel guilty because the way that our society tries to keep people in line with the norms of society is to impute, or to impart, I should say, guilty feelings. But that would fit up here with the interconnectedness in the social institutions. The sinful structure of our social institutions are that it helps keep us in line, so to speak, by making us feel guilty when we don't follow those institutions. A light example of that would be when I was a child, they wanted me to wear dresses at school. So going against that and wearing pants, they tried to make me feel really guilty because I would wear my snow pants, because I was allowed to wear snow pants because, you know, I lived in near Lake Erie, so it would snow a lot back then. And so I walked to school and I would wear snow pants. I didn't want to take them off, but they made me feel guilty for not taking them off because it was against the social norm. You're supposed to wear a skirt, and you're not supposed to wear pants underneath the skirt. Yeah, so that's probably a light example, but I'm sure we have other examples as well. And people who defy the social norms often are called out and they try to make them feel guilty, even when what they're actually doing is going against guilt, going against actual guilt. Does that make sense? Yeah, no, maybe? Okay, so forgiveness then is willing the well-being of all involved. I like the way she defines forgiveness. Willing the well-being of all involved with the greatest possible knowledge of each and all, both victim and violator. Now, she thinks that forgiveness is something that is helpful for the victim. She talks about how we can get stuck in our anger, and it harms us more than it harms the person who is guilty. It harms us if we're the victim more than the violator. She also names forgiveness in a way that does not need to include reestablishing a relationship or inviting that person who violated you back into your life. This is particularly helpful in her analysis of women who are in, or others, anybody who's in a relationship that is filled with abuse. You can forgive the abuser without inviting them back into your space. You can will them well-being. You can will that they you can will that they come to realize that they've got an anger problem, or they've got a hatred of people like you. And they need to address that in order for them to find well-being. But you don't have to let them back into your space, and you can still forgive them. Now, I don't know if that's helpful for anybody, a helpful way of thinking about it. This has sometimes been controversial when I've taught this in the past. People say, oh, that's not the best way to think about it. Hang on just a second. Hang on just a second. Talk amongst yourselves.
But show, yeah, did that comment help clear things up, Sarah and Zach, Sarah Lynn and Zach?
Yeah, it made a lot of sense once I thought about it.
Okay, yeah. At least from how I understood your question, because yeah, they wouldn't. I mean, they wouldn't see there as being an eternal now, and past and present are ultimately ontologically very different from the future. I hesitate to use the word less real because they're both, because it's, I mean, they're not putting more weight in the static things that have a fact determined about them. If anything, dynamism is like, and creativity is most important for process metaphysics, but the future is real in a very different way than past and present is. So in a sense, it wouldn't be, a part of that. It's just kind of how our language separates them, but it's almost a very different thing.
Yeah, Wesley, when he was talking about that, he was talking in relation to the doctrine of predestination and all that. And how his understanding was different from Calvin's, and how basically past or past and future were not things that that God used. It wasn't terminology, but it was relevant to God because God saw everything as eternal. Now we use past and future to explain things in our own, finite existence. Now, in that open relational sense, yeah, God is working within time, but we also remember that God is outside of time. And so there is a little ambiguity of trying to understand how the future remains open. But I think a helpful way of looking at it is how Wesley looks at it in relation to that predestination question. God predestines all, meaning God makes a way for all to be saved, but not all will choose that, make that choice. And so there's that opportunity for decision, which is very, as we've been talking about, in line with the process perspective, that the decisions that we make a difference and have some weight to them. So I think that's where it's easy for Wesleyans to move into that more open and relational system, because all of the elements are there, and we can, we go into that line of thinking sometimes. But yeah, with past, present, future, they're tools that we use to try to understand what's going on in time.
Yeah. Well, Zach, what you said is different than what Jared said. So I don't know how long we want to talk about this, but I would say what Jared said made sense to me, but what you said sounded like you contradicted yourself to me.
Oh, did I?
So, I mean, like, it makes sense to say that the past and the present are like, that the future is less real in process theology, in the sense like that there's a real, like, it really hasn't happened yet, and God is just aware of all the possibilities.
That's process.
That makes sense. And that's what Jared was saying. But when you say that God was outside of time, and so past, present, and future are ways that we think about things as finite beings, that sounds like classical theism to me.
Well, that's Wesley's perspective, because Wesley was a classical theist, and that's where
so yeah, I'm saying Wesley, I would agree with. Yeah. I mean, I would agree with Wesley, but that's different than process theology. I don't see how it makes it easier to transfer into, is what I'm trying to say.
I think I'm just going to interrupt for a minute, and if you guys to kind of continue in this line of thinking, you can. But the notion here is that for process that I want to make sure is clear, for process theology, and for Suchocki in particular, God is, the future is not determined. There is this weird, and I don't know that it's going to be helpful for us. There's this weird, like, Hartshorn thinks God's going opposite than we are, and it just is too complicated. That and Suchocki follows more Hartshorn than Cobb. Cobb follows non-Hartshorn, follows Whitehead instead of Hartshorn. Anyway, but the idea is the conclusion here is that for process, we and God's future, the future for everything is open. Now, that doesn't mean that the past isn't a factor in what could happen in the future, right? There are limitations about what the future could be. For example, I could not become president of the United States because I have not spent my life doing the kinds of things that one would need to do in order to move in that direction. Whereas Jared is probably still young enough to start doing that. Now, the question of whether or not Jared would have enough money to run for president at some point, who knows? He might win the lottery. Of course, he'd have to play the lottery, and I have a feeling he doesn't. But so there's some possibilities that are just not going to happen, just are not possible, right? There's other possibilities that are way unlikely. And then there are possibilities that are likely. So it's likely that Jared will continue in his study and go and enter into a PhD program and become a professor at some point. That's a likely possibility. It's also a possibility that he will go into a different line of work and not get a PhD in theology, but maybe decide to be, I don't know, what else would you do with a Kierkegaardian bent? Maybe he'll become a pastor.
Thinking about library school, so librarian.
Yeah, maybe he'll become a library scientist. So there's these different possibilities, but God doesn't know which one Jared will choose. Does that help? Or was that just the same thing? Any other questions about that? Did you guys want to go back to your?
Yeah, sorry. And sorry, Zach, I wasn't trying to be curt. I just felt like it was kind of off topic. And so I was just quickly saying.
Oh, no, I was moving in and out between process position and Wesley's original position, which Wesley is very much classical theist, but some of the elements of his theology are shared with the process thought. And so it's easy for Wesley into that. So, yeah.
Since he was an Armenian and a free will theist, but nevertheless a classical theist rather than,
Right.
So,
all the elements are there for us to jump
right.
into that spot, but Wesley was very much classical. Yeah.
Right.
Yes, but I brought up Wesley because for two reasons. One, because Suchocki is a Methodist and follows more of a Wesleyan way of thinking about sin and what humans are called to do, not necessarily how Wesley understands who God is, because that's very different, but in terms of how Wesley focuses the discussion about sin and the point of not sinning really in this world, rather than individual relationship with God. For Wesley, it's much more of a how we relate to each other and how we are changing ourselves in that relational world. Wesley wants us to be in groups. Well, doesn't want us to be. He suggests groups that enable us to build our will to not sin, build our understanding of what's the best way to love and what's the best way to treat the other people and what's the best way to let go of these patterns or habits of sinfulness and self-centeredness. For him, that's much more important and interesting than reflecting upon whether or not you're prideful in relation to God or stuck in relation to actualizing your potential. Does that help? Yeah. So it is interesting. It was just an interesting conversation that Suchocki and I had over the weekend. And unfortunately, she has to go to a doctor's appointment, so she's not going to be able to join us. But we had hoped she was going to join us. And her daughter had her computer, and so she didn't get the message, the how do you sign on and stuff. So that's what that was all about. But maybe another time. So going back to the discussion about forgiveness, I mean, I think it's an interesting way of thinking about forgiveness that helps us, that makes it a matter of will rather than a matter of emotion. And it's not that the emotion isn't important. It's that the emotion is, it's hard to emotionally forgive someone who harmed you in a horrible way. It's another thing to begin to say, well, I'm going to will the well-being for them. I'm not going to imagine them burning in hell, or I'm not going to imagine them hanging by their toes naked while everybody throws hot oil at them, or however you imagine it, whatever it is that you imagine. Instead, imagining them coming to realize the harm that they have done and to change the way they approach the world, to will the well-being, to will that person, for them, the well-being, for the person who has violated me, the well-being would include having a honest interpretation of what they did, or what's happened. And so in that way, it to just personally speaking, it's a little bit easier for me to understand forgiveness in that way. And then it takes off some of the emotional baggage. So it's not, you have to like that person, right? It's willing the well-being for them. And willing the well-being for me, which probably in many situations has to do with willing the other person's well-being and willing my well-being. They're interconnected. And perhaps that means we aren't connected anymore. But it's actually better for me to not be filled with anger and visions of vengeance or anything.
Yeah. And I think, like, I personally think that this way of thinking about forgiveness is really helpful in the context of, like, at least in the United States, we if we want to have this vision of forgiveness, which I think is important to have, like, we need to all be much more connected to each other than we are, because right now it's like there's not really much of a way for forgiveness to be anything but interpersonal, in, like, the way that we operate a lot of times in our current context. But the thing I value a lot about Suchocki is this really strong emphasis on interdependence and interconnectedness, because I think forgiveness, like the way that she is talking about it here, it's like, if I want well-being for that person, and I'm picturing well-being for them, I'm picturing them, like, still being able to be in community with others, even if they're no longer in community with me. And then, so it's like, a lot of times forgiveness, I think, in that paradigm comes from this network of relationships where, like, we can all still be in relationality with others, in a way that's different than, like, yeah, I don't necessarily have to be the person that makes things okay relationally for the person who's wronged me or for the person I have wronged. So I like that way of thinking about it. I think it just gets really messy really fast because yeah, if we just talk about sort of, it doesn't really work so well in, like, sin as being interpersonal.
Can you say more about that? What do you mean? Doesn't work if sin is interpersonal.
Well, it doesn't work as well if sin is, like, only, like, if we're talking about I'm wishing interpersonally, I think it helps to have an example. So, like, this summer I did CPE, and there was a guy who reminded me a lot of my father-in-law, where my family is estranged from. And he reminded me a lot of him. He is also estranged from his kids, and was having a really hard time in the hospital. And I remember thinking, like, I couldn't be there for my father-in-law in the way that I'm being there for this man, but I hope that one day when my father-in-law is in the hospital, that there's a chaplain who can sit with him and in his feelings of how hard it is to be estranged from his children. That requires, so it's like, on the one hand, I do wish my father-in-law well, but other people have to be in relationship for him, I think, for that wellness to happen, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So we
so,
should.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So that I think that's what I mean by interpersonal. It's like, if forgiveness is only running between me and my father-in-law, like, I do think other people have to come into play. Yeah.
So other people have to participate in the forgiveness, or other people are part of what you're willing?
Other people are part of what I'm willing.
Yeah. That makes perfect sense. Yeah.
Yeah, I've thought about it a lot, like in terms of like kind of the abolitionist movements, happening now. And I think like we think about reconciliation and forgiveness in like in Christian circles a lot as about that interpersonal one-to-one. Now this particular relationship has been restored, which I think there's something to that, but there's also just, I don't know, like my mom, has serious mental illness and has done a lot of harm to our family. And like, I really hope that she is well at some point, but like the relationship that we have, mother-daughter relationship, for example, it doesn't work for me to set boundaries or be that directive with her. I mean, I can set boundaries, and I do, but like, I can't be that directive towards her because our relationship is not that kind of relationship. So like, in terms of a mother-daughter, like, she's always had authority over me, as my mother. So for that to switch is like, in this context, is really hard for her. But like, a communal response, for example, is like, I feel, I kind of have reflected on it in my own life as like, well, maybe that's part of why I feel called to the work that I do in the Catholic Worker, where we take in people who have mental illness or I'm facing homelessness, which she has been on and off. Because like, I hope someone does that for her who doesn't have that kind of relationship where they cannot set healthy boundaries that she would respect. I don't know, does that make sense? So like, willing the well-being is, I think what Grace is getting at, I really like, is a communal response. It is something where we want to create communities that will help everyone experience well-being, even though on the individual level, there could be harm or relational aspects that just don't allow that one-on-one ability to do it.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Sarah Lynn, and thank you, Grace, for sharing those examples. Those are really helpful. Yeah. And I think this is one of the places where Suchocki's view of forgiveness is really helpful. Her view that she expresses in this book are they really get at some issues that need to be addressed theologically and are often kind of brushed over. Oh, just forgive people, right? But that's not easy, right? And how do you do that in a way that is both integrous to you and to the nature of the relationship, that be helpful for everybody involved? It's not going to be helpful for Sarah Lynn or for Grace to say, oh yeah, sure, come on over and wreak havoc on my life.
I wanted to add, I think I really liked everything about that forgiveness and transformation sections. I would say the only thing that I think in my own theology want to explore more is this idea of paying one's debt. So like on page 154, she talks about, and I didn't bring this up in my discussion starter, but it would be another question. And I feel like it's not central to her thesis, though. It's just something that she says. but she talks about paying one's debt. Ordinarily, forgiveness between an individual and a society has been regulated to the courts of law and our penal system. There one learns what it is to pay one's debt. But if original sin in this new context is valid, then we all have a debt to pay. And so, yeah, I was a little bummed that she like didn't challenge the notion of paying one's debt at all, because it seems like with harm, there's almost no, when it's like violent harm, especially, there's no way to repay your debt. Like it just actually isn't possible. You know what I mean? Like you can repay your debt if you steal money and you help them out, give the money back, then you can repay that debt. You still haven't actually repaid the debt because it does more harm than just the money, right? And so we try to do that in the legal system. We have like these huge amounts of money that people have to pay back to like pay back the harm that they somehow did, emotional or psychological harm. And I just would say that's the only part of this whole section that I was like questioning. And I don't think it's central to her ideas. But I actually think she could maybe come around. I wish she was here, to maybe thinking that that's not the best way to go about it, because one, again, there's no way to repay debts for harm. There is a way to like take responsibility and maybe pay money or do something to help if you're able to, but you never actually pay it off as if it never happened or something. And the way our penal system works, where we do that, often just causes harm to the violator or the perpetrator in a way that continues to cycle harm through communities. And so it doesn't end up willing the well-being of the perpetrator at all. It has nothing to do with forgiveness, unless we can accept and all just accept that we can't actually quantify harm in that way. It doesn't work. Anyway, that just was my opinion about that section.
I actually read that as her point, was that's how it has happened, and it's not an effective way, was actually how I read that section.
Yeah, I think she's using that term in a pejorative way, or in a way of saying, people are put in jail as if that can pay their debt to society. But then she's then using the same term, which would have been more helpful if she had not, she'd kept that in parentheses to say, this is another question or another direction to go in an exploration that she hasn't gone into deeply enough in this book, because it's focused on something else. But that is, how do we engage the social evil? How do you offer forgiveness for social evil? How do you participate in social evil, in social sins that you're not really aware of that you're doing? How can those things be forgiven? How do you forgive yourself? How do others forgive you? That does seem to be a big issue at the end of this book, where she's saying, there's so much more here that this analysis opens us to. How does one receive forgiveness for social sins in which you participate in that you didn't know you were doing, and even once you don't know how to stop participating in them? That seems like those are almost rhetorical questions, but and I think it's really good to point those out and say, yes, this is a helpful way, perhaps, thinking about how we relate to individuals, how individual relationships occur, and how individual relationships are actually much more related to a whole network of connections with others. But there's also these social sins that she talks about in terms of one of the ways of thinking about inherited sin, and how do we even engage forgiveness then? How does a institution forgive, or how do you forgive an institution? How do you will the well-being of the institution? Yeah, I mean, this was something that I remember talking with her about a while back, that it's sticky. And I think there is she does want to say that there is a way in which we can start, that institutions can start doing that. But she doesn't develop it fully. Any other comments about that? Does that make any sense to anyone else? I mean, it's kind of the fabric of what we've been born into, like original sin. So she invites us then to participate in other institutions and communities that can help transform the world toward the way that God imagines the world, with truth, love, and beauty. Is that?
So the class that several of us in this class are taking on, public theology and poverty and mass incarceration. Actually, in reading this book and hearing you talk today about the, whether you participate and know you're sinning and not know, as we're learning more and more about the carceral system, I kind of go there with that, because I've known and been active in much of the movement, like around our death penalty here. But as I learn more about just the number of people who are arrested and sit in jail forever and haven't even been in front of a judge, and my tax dollars pay for that. And I voted for people who, and learning that system, that kind of relates to some of this. And so when I read that part, that's what I was thinking about, was, have I participated in that system that jails people in a way that I don't think is legal or right or moral. So that's what I've read through that. And what do I do now that I know it?
Yeah, that's the hard part. I mean,
Yeah.
It's hard to be made aware of it. And then sometimes it feels so overwhelming, like everything we do is connected to the corruption of the people who have the power, have created structures that are also really good at hiding that, or making it invisible, so that nobody knows what is actually happening. Because people don't imagine that that's what happens. I mean, I didn't imagine that that's what happens. You get arrested, you don't have to stay there for a long time without even being charged with anything or brought before a judge that seems counter to what we're taught the process is supposed to be. Yeah. So other comments? Or I don't like Zoom. It's just like okay.
It really flattens everything. Like everyone,
Everything,
just everything is flatter. It's hard.
yeah. And it doesn't, like when I'm in a classroom, the energy brings up completely different ideas and thoughts. And so things flow much more smoothly and organically, I should say, with the community. Yeah, with the group. I know that we have a fabulous discussion starter coming up. Let me just say a couple extra things here that are in the notes here. And I think it's helpful on Suchocki, on page 152 of Suchocki, where she talks about the memory, empathy, and imagination as it is engaged with God, that God is actually in God, the fullness of memory, empathy, and imagination are fulfilled as truth, love, and beauty that she talked about earlier. And she develops that on page, so that's both page kind of moving from 152 to 158, where she highlights those as well. the connection there, that forgiveness in God, the criterion of well-being, truth, love, and beauty, and the elements that make for forgiveness, memory, empathy, and imagination merge, so that in a sense, one might say that the divine character is forgiveness, which may be helpful for our discussion. There's one more point that when we come back from break, but there's one more point before we go to break, is this eschatological notion. So what does this all mean for when we die and what God holds for us? Did anybody see the movie Flatliners? So someone who saw it, tell us a little bit what you remember about it, and I'll try to fill in the rest.
So did anybody else see it? So this group of college kids who are studying to be doctors, I believe, but they all become obsessed with what happens after you die. So they take turns taking each other to the point of death and then bringing each other back and to try to figure out what happens after you die. And what happens for them is they each bring back, I guess, something of their past. Like one of them sees a little girl that he used to pick on in a playground, and I forget the rest of them, but just several things from their past, and it's usually something they've done wrong that they need to reconcile, basically, if I remember correctly. It's been years.
Yeah, but that's great. Yeah, so there's a sense in which these memories are held by God, or in some, I mean, they don't talk about God, but if we look at it from a Suchockian perspective, right? So these memories of your past, the places where you have failed in transcendence, when failed in memory, empathy, and beauty, love, a truth, you're reliving them until you kind of work through them and try to make amends in some way. I mean, he goes back and apologizes to her and says it was wrong. I shouldn't have done those things. And then he's not stuck in those anymore. And the idea is, the reason why I bring that up, because I think it's a little bit like the way Suchocki might understand what it means to, as you continue to live with subjective immortality in God, that the memories are there, both of the ways in which you've been loved, but also in the ways in which you've failed that, and how, and you are encouraged, lured toward resolving those in some way, which, doesn't, as Sarah Lynn reminds us, it doesn't fix what happened in the past, but at least it's doing something about it in terms of confronting it yourself and expressing regret and willing for something better. And I think that's an interesting way of imagining how forgiveness and functions in God.
Well, I wonder too, can't remember if she said this or if this was just something I was thinking about when I was reading it. So you can just respond, I guess, generally. But like, there's a sense in which I got the impression, or I was at least thinking about, like, that, I mean, I don't think we can pay, if we try to quantify harm, and I am for reparations and all kinds, because that's willing the well-being for the victim, right? To pay them back or to help out, like I said, with reparations or things like that. But if you think about it in terms of like a debt that you're trying to, like, that will somehow make up for the harm, and you try to quantify it, you can never pay off the debt. But if you think about it in terms of willing the well-being, and then like there might be good reasons to pay someone back, but it's different than exonerating yourself or something. So but like with the past and the harm in the past, there, I felt like there was a sense in which we could think that like I was wondering if you could think about it like the way, like the past can actually change through forgiveness. Like it's transformative, like that act of willing the well-being for each other is transformative in a way in which that's almost the only way to actually repair the harm, which is counterintuitive if you think about harm as debt. Does that make sense? What I was just something I was thinking about.
Yeah, I don't think she thinks of harm as debt. I mean, I think that's an old,
No, I'm not blaming Suchocki for that.
Yeah.
That is a way that people think about harm. She used the term, so it got me thinking about it.
Mhm.
But yeah, I agree. I don't think that's what she was saying. I think you guys were right about that. But in general, like I guess I was responding, Dr. Russell, to the idea that you can never get rid of the harm or something. And I was just reflecting on that, like maybe you can, through forgiveness, actually get rid of the harm. Like maybe you can actually repair the past, but it's not through paying off a debt. It's through this process that she's talking about, where the past is within God. And when it's fully acknowledged and we begin to be able to will the well-being for one another and imagine a different future, that whole process actually, because the past is within God, can transform the past and transform even the harm that was in the past. That's what I was kind of thinking about.
That is very much, I think, what Suchocki has in mind. Yes.
And that
So
sounds like
in God, then it is transformed in God.
and it sounds like it plays into then Wesley's idea of living into Christian perfection. You feel guilt, and so you realize what you've done wrong and you work towards always getting better, and that helps within the community as well.
Yeah, I think Suchocki would agree with that. I think she'd be happy to hear that we're seeing her in a Wesleyan light, because I think it was one of those times when she was writing this. It was when I first met her, actually. She was in the process of writing it, and she was not focused on the Wesleyan part. She was focused on these other theologians. But then in the conversation I had with her recently, it was like, yeah, I should have put Wesley in that more. That's much more helpful. Yeah. But and what Sarah Lynn, you're saying, that's the way that you've said it has the kind of complexity that the way that Suchocki would articulate it as well too. Yeah. So there is this notion of grace that that's not simply, it's not transactional. Right? It's something that's transformative, and that it only happens in grace as we are participating in it. Yeah. Other questions? So I'm going to invite us to go ahead and take a break. And when we come back, I'm going to invite Sarah Lynn to lead us in the discussion. Hopefully you've all read her very helpful summary. And so let's come back in about 20 minutes. That gives you enough time to read over it as well, if you haven't read it. And I would like to talk with actually Dee Dee and Grace and Zach just for a minute. Jared, you can come along too.
Yeah, also, actually, I need to, Chance isn't signed up for a discussion yet. So I wanted to make sure that, yeah. Seems like the only dates we didn't have, at least somebody already slotted, were the 29th and the 6th of December, November and December, respectively. He said he'd be willing to do the 29th, which is listed as a group discussion, and I didn't know if we can make him the leader of that instead.
Well, hang on. Where is Chance on the group in the meeting here too?
Yep, I'm here.
Okay, so let me take a look at the syllabus.
And Dr. Russell, what just some more clarity about what happened with mine. Dee Dee and I had switched a while ago. She was going to go in September, and then when that week came, I don't know if time ran short or something, but so yeah, but I'm happy to see what we can work out.
Okay, so what we have right now is we have Dee Dee and Grace and Zach all geared up for next week, right?
I kind of remember 2 weeks from now.
Well, is it 2 weeks from now? Yes, it's 2 weeks from now. Sorry. Thinking in the future. And that's the 8th.
Yes.
And then we have Amber signed up for the 15th, but Amber and Zach, is Zach here? And where's Dee Dee?
They're all here. Dee Dee's typing in the chat.
Okay. So we're gonna add, and Dee Dee is in, I don't see any chat. Where's the chat?
She was just clarifying. It's the 8th.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So, and I know, Zach, you've got, Dee Dee,
Yeah,
are
I
you in the
don't-
same group as Amber?
So Dee Dee and I are in the same group. This is Grace.
Yes, I know, but I'm thinking, so let's put Dee Dee, let's put you on the 15th. Can you do that? No, you can't do that?
Well, no was from a previous thing.
Okay,
So yes, she can do the 15th.
okay, that would work out when then, so then they'd be a group. All right. Okay, I'm trying.
From talking to a lawyer friend or classmate, actually, about it over this weekend, I'm fairly, she said that she'd be surprised if I had to go in, because usually they're stuff like that's usually settled before, so she didn't think I'd have to go in, but I have no idea. So
Okay, so either Zach will either do the 8th or the 15th, and Amber will take over for Zach if she has to, or she'll continue to keep the 15th. And then Dee Dee will do the 15th, so there'll be one of you in each for each group. That's the way we can do having more than one. And then you say Chance needs to do one as well. And how did you not get one in?
I have no idea.
So I'm thinking either the 29th, which I think is probably best.
Yeah.
'Cause the 6th
Said he
is our
would
last
do that.
day, right? And then we'll
Yeah.
stairway to heaven. So let's put you in the 29th. And we'll just create a discussion starter for you. So you would be,
It's
Does that make sense
like
to you?
liturgy and sacraments for our denominations, if I remember correctly. That's the,
yes, yes. And so you'd be reading short readings from Way of Blessing and from James Cone.
And those are found on the syllabus or in the lessons tab. Is that right?
Yes, under the 29th.
Perfect. All right. Thank you. Is that all I need?
I think you're good to go, Chase. Yep.
All right. Thank you, guys.
All right. All right. Thanks, everybody. All right. Thanks, Jared. Does that work for you?
Yeah, sure. Sorry. No, I'm talking with Dee Dee. So yeah. So does this mean whichever content is assigned on that day, correct? Do you recall what is on that day? Same group and yeah, yes. So wait, that would be the 15th, right? For Dee Dee.
Yeah.
So I'm just giving her the content off the.
I just changed this and why did it not work? Damn it.
The real things is coming next week. The real things will be here next week. Yes, he will.
People read that, or that's the context in which I'm asking this other question, I mean, feel free to do that.
Oh. Okay. Let me see.
I think it's really good. You did a really great job.
Yeah.
Yeah, of course I did.
Oh, no, I'm just looking at the
Did you-
paper, trying to find something that I would want to say. Okay. I can kind of intro my first question, I guess.
Yeah, just to have a, maybe even just an intro of, I read this book and here's, you read what I've had to say, and then I have some questions. We can start with whichever question you want to start with, or you can ask a different question, or you can ask people if they have questions.
Yeah.
Whichever works for you.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I didn't really evaluate the book I just did a summary, and a discussion starter. So I feel like it was similar to what that part was similar to what we went over in class so far.
Yeah. So is everybody back? We're going to go ahead and start. There's Jared. Hey, Carrie. All right, looks like everybody's back.
Okay, great.
We lose Dee Dee. No, there she is. Okay.
Yeah, I guess before I go into my discussion starter questions, I'll give a moment if anyone else had any questions from what they read or something they wanted to discuss. That's fine.
One point of clarity that I think would be helpful for me, and I know, like, Dr. Russell, you touched on this a little bit, but this idea of like we had to be cruel in the past, like this, because of like meat eaters and things like that, like we had to do these violent things in the past, but we're being drawn more toward like these better choices. I think you sort of mentioned like we're proceeding based on the assumption that like that is true, like this, that this is this anthropological understanding is the true one. So I guess my question was though, so what if there are alternative anthropological views about how human beings like made their societies? And I don't know if I'm doing a good job explaining this necessarily, but that was one thing that came up for me when I was reading. It's like, it does seem like a lot of her argument for the fall to violence, and then like our responses to it did rely a lot on that understanding.
I have a question about that, clarifying question, Grace, for you. When you are thinking about alternative anthropologies, So when I read Suchocki, I thought that she was kind of referring to like hominoid kind of, but not Homo sapiens. So like animals that in our evolutionary history that
okay.
became Homo sapiens. So I'm not sure she was applying her fall to violence to humans specifically.
Okay.
And I'm wondering if that's what you're thinking she was doing.
Yeah, and that just what you said there was really helpful. So
Yeah.
yeah.
So if I could add to that, whether she is or not, if you want to look just at the biblical statements, it allows for meat eating after, I think, Noah's Ark incident. And so therefore, whether you're looking at it from just a biblical worldview or anthropologically, it still comes into play.
Sure.
That bit of acceptable or non-acceptable violence and where is God's will in all that.
I'm not sure what you mean, Amber, in reference to what I thought we were talking about. So like,
I might have misunderstood then.
Well, I mean, what you just described, maybe this will clarify. What you just described was there were human beings who were not allowed to eat meat. And in fact, we have the biblical story of the Garden of Eden. There are vegetarians in the Garden of Eden. And then at some point after the Noah's Ark story, you're saying God allowed meat eating in certain forms. And I guess when you say that, that sounds opposite to what Suchocki describes, because what Suchocki is describing, as far as I understand it, is pre-human Homo sapiens within our evolutionary history are doing violence, meat eating, and that helped develop a brain that Homo sapiens have, and we become human beings and are able to have consciousness. And then after that, maybe there would be a push towards something like vegetarianism. She doesn't talk about that directly, but that's like the opposite of what you described, where it's vegetarian and then meat eating sanctions. Does that make sense why I was confused?
Yes, so what I was also referring to Grace's question as well, and I'm taking into account two different views. The biblical worldview, meaning there was creation just as it appears in the Bible, and that's how things progressed. And then I was also looking at your anthropological evolutionary view. So the scientific way as opposed to the fundamentalist way of looking at things. And then I was just, my only point was that whichever way you're looking at it, Suchocki's description of how she sees guilt and violence and such, and how that plays into how we are as people today, still comes into play, whether you're looking at one way or the other.
Well, can you explain how Suchocki's understanding comes into play with the biblical account where God sanctions meat eating? Before that, they were vegetarians?
Well, the part of meat eating necessarily involves violence towards animals.
But I guess I'm confused because God's sanctioning it. So it's a fall to violence that God is saying you should do? That's what I'm confused.
That you can do, making it allowed for human beings to have that propensity for violence, if you will, which then adds to the culpability of God, which she also mentions in there as well.
Did anyone else see Suchocki talk about God being culpable for violence?
Yeah, early on in part two, it seemed to me that she was making an argument through the different dimensions she was saying that, or scenarios that, and I have to go back and find it, that because of X, Y, and Z, then God cannot be held responsible for sin or violence.
Yeah, so yeah, Amber, so I'm not tracking, but I'm wondering if someone else was tracking then with what you're saying, where God would be culpable for sanctioning violence.
Then I'm with Amber as well. I think if I understand what she's saying, then meat eating, although it might cause harm, cannot be considered violent if it's sanctioned by God, and God can't be held responsible. So there is, yeah, it's a ball of yarn that you're gonna have to unravel. But I see both sides. I do see what Amber's saying.
So I also wonder if I can interject just a minute here. Even though Suchocki personally herself is a vegetarian, and unlike Ron Allen, she does not think bacon counts as a vegetable on Fridays. But anyway, she is making an argument that unnecessary violence is sinful, not necessary violence. So eating meat may be seen as necessary violence. And the problem comes from when the violence that is necessary, life is robbery, becomes gratuitous or becomes one gets overzealous about the killing, or one gets greedy and kills lots and lots of animals, more than are actually needed, as the meat industry might lead us to discuss, but that's a different issue perhaps. So
Well, and I, if
help
I
the
personally
argument.
felt good about where we landed, just Sarah Lynn's response clarified something for me just about her argument. So I'm happy, if we want to keep talking about this, that's great, but I feel good. It was just my initial question that kind of brought some of this up. So, but we can keep talking about it too.
Mhm. Well, I think the two things that Amber raised that I find interesting to think about is, one, I did ask, my discussion target was about the distinction between necessary and unnecessary violence, because how do we discern what's necessary or unnecessary, and it does this, the fact that you're still harming another being, even if it's necessary for yourself, how can there be is that possible from an eschatological point of view, then to say that all is well for all beings? So that was just part of the question. So then it's like, if we have this understanding of sin as being unnecessary violence, what does that mean with the ways in which life is necessarily violent in some ways? The other part of it that I find interesting, and it kind of relates to my second question, is I actually didn't see Suchocki's perspective fitting the kind of biblical view of the Garden of Eden, where people are vegetarians and then later on they start doing violence. So the Garden of Eden story is kind of like a idyllic, there's not any violence, and then violence happens later. So her view seems to be based in an evolutionary perspective. And so I found that interesting to kind of consider. How do you put it in conversation with the way the Bible talks about sin and violence? She also doesn't agree that death, for example, is a part of what, or anxiety about death as the central thing that perpetuates sin. But again, the language that Paul uses is often this idea of sin and death as being powers, and that the sting of death is sin. He talks about, for example, in Hebrews. So yeah, if anyone else wants to chime in about either violence and unnecessary violence, or how you would put this on conversation with a biblical view, because I really saw it as being different than the biblical way of talking about these things.
Yeah, I'm was reading and I'm listening, and at first it seemed pretty clear to me. Necessary and unnecessary, I get it, until because I'm always the devil's advocate, who gets to determine what's necessary and what's unnecessary. Amber just brought up a point, so we're vegetarians, but the animals eat vegetables and we're eating vegetables. Are we not causing harm? to the animals, and is that necessary or unnecessary? It's an interesting read, interesting perspective, but it's certainly more to it than meets the eye.
Yeah, I agree with Reagan there, because when you're getting into points of what is necessary evil, when you're looking at a society of people who are having to live together, and there are necessarily lines within which one needs to live, if one is not prone to live within those guidelines, then it comes to some sort of violence, be that not necessarily like killing someone, but it could be construed as mental violence to constrain that person into the guidelines necessary for a civil society or a civil social group. And who makes that decision? If you kick that person out of the social group, then that is also another form of violence to that person. If you make them conform, that is another, so could be construed as another sort of violence. And even though it's necessary for the whole, was it really necessary for the individual? So it becomes really gray quick, it seems like.
I think I, in now my reading, but when the violence turns to contest and social control versus just the meeting, and I remember thinking about the hierarchy of need. So if I need to kill to eat to survive versus if I need to kill to be in charge of my home. I mean, I was thinking about those kinds of things when I was reading it, and I don't know where that's at now.
Does anyone else have any thoughts on this question of how you discern necessary and unnecessary violence, or is there something within this kind of perspective that would, I guess, provide an impetus or a kind of a like moral kind of draw towards trying to reduce violence at all, if you're willing the well-being of all of creation?
Yeah, I think it's interesting, like, to think about this in terms of like humans and enacting violence on animals. And I am not saying this to like try and be callous towards animals. I think animal rights are really important, but I think it's also important to think about like necessary violence in terms of like what we deem as necessary in terms of like interpersonal violence too. Like, and what might be necessary. Because to me, I think it's just the idea of necessary versus unnecessary violence seems way too slippery to have anything other than a position of like, we should in all ways try to be less violent. And I know that that is hard to define too, but it's bringing me back a little bit to our discussion on like, what does it mean to be human? And I know that I was the one who was bringing up like a lot of the criteria that we were coming up with. It's like, there was something that bothered me about all of it being like this very intellectual kind of requirements. And it just made me think of, in terms of what people might think of as necessary evil. I know someone who's, I don't know them personally, I followed their story online, but their child was denied a heart transplant because they have Down syndrome. And so I think like that's where this whole like gradation of what kind of violence is allowed, it just becomes way too slippery for me to wrap my mind around like it as an important concept. And Dr. Russell, I don't know if you're directed, I wonder what you think this means to me. Okay.
No, that I just interrupt you. That was the question for Sarah, because it doesn't make much sense to me. But anyway,
Okay.
Paul often doesn't make much sense because he seems to say opposite things. But at any rate, it does seem like the classes, I'm just going to say this one thing. It seems like we're getting wrapped up in trying to figure out the details of whether this would be sin or that would be sin. And I don't think Suchocki's point is to say, here's foolproof criteria to use about whether to figure out whether that part's a sin because it was necessary. Because, it's like, it reminds me of Augustine trying to figure out, well, I only need really 3 grams of food to eat in order to survive, but I really eat 5 because then I feel less hungry and I can concentrate on my work. But am I really trying to come up with a reason for eating 5 instead of 3? And I think all of those details are not really what Suchocki's trying to help us engage with. I think rather she's saying, instead of focusing our attention on sin as only about God, which causes us or demands that we make kind of big leaps and indirect connections. Well, God is not happy when I'm harming my friend. Okay, why not just say sin is harming your friend instead of it's going against God's construction of who I should harm or who I can't harm, or if I should harm or not harm. And, I look at my friend and I see that she's hurt. So that's not good. I want to stop doing what's hurting her, as opposed to, well, here's, 5, you can have 5 grams of protein as long as you get it from this animal that was about to die anyway. Or you can, I don't think that's her point. I think her point is, let's think about this more directly and allow there to be a big birth of, we're not quite sure whether that's a sin or not, perhaps. But we know over here, this is, obviously harming persons. And this is maybe, but there's a necessary reason. And if you, again, you might be kidding yourself when you're trying to figure it out, but I think she's giving us tools to try to help us do that. But
I was actually trying to bring up the question though, to address like the eschatological vision. So like her eschatological vision is that all shall we be well and all manners of things shall be well. And I'm saying, if there is unnecessary violence, or if there is necessary violence that we must do to live, which is something she talks about, how do we conceive of or work towards the idea that all shall be well and all manners of things shall be well? Because we are necessarily doing some violence against other living beings and things will not be well for them. So then I was just thinking about, like, what does that mean for our ethic in this life? Does that eschatological vision then affect our practical ethics in terms of trying to minimize the amount of necessary violence we need to do? So I wasn't trying to have a conversation about whether or not every little thing is this or that, but like this idea of like, what does this look like from that, with that sense of like a drive towards this eschatological vision of everything being well? Because we could potentially make violence that was necessary unnecessary. It's not like they have to stay that way, Does that make sense?
everything
Yeah,
into the go ahead. No, go
Or-
ahead, Rick.
No, I was just saying what you just said, Sarah Lynn, is what I was saying earlier, that we begin to muddy the waters as it relates to who gets to determine what's necessary and what's unnecessary. Yeah, that's what I was saying.
Yeah, and then, do we do we think then it's similar to, Monica Coleman, who would say that you cannot have kind of that true eschatological vision only happens within God. Like it's a sense in which you don't actually attain it, or it's unattainable when beings are alive physically. I don't know. Does that make sense? Is there something within process theology that kind of necessarily believes that the fullness of an eschatological vision only could possibly exist beyond this life in God? I've just been thinking about it, and I'm curious if anyone else got that from this or not. Can we have all manners of things well with a living existence, or does life necessitate mean that some things won't be well for some people?
Well, I think that leads back to the kind of cognitive thinking through that. So back kind of to Dr. Russell's point, you kind of have to think about those individual, what it means to do something in order to maybe wrap your head around what we're talking about. At least so from my perspective, if I am not thinking about what my next move is, for example, if I'm eating Brazil nuts, those Brazil nuts came from trees that parrots need to eat. And so if I'm using all those Brazil nuts, then the birds don't have something to eat. Now, while I'm not trying to determine if that's a sin or not, but I'm using that as an example to then go to that eschatological possibility that in this life, as we are all thinking and being in our own ways of knowing, I don't see how that is possible. It almost has to be on a different plane. That being said, back to what might be a process way of thinking, in our evolution of the way we become and the ways we could become thinking beings towards God's higher way of thinking, we could do that, and that's going, I'm thinking way out there, because I don't anticipate we're anywhere near that now. And as far as I know, the sun or the earth may be so far away from the sun by that time it couldn't happen, which leads back to it may just be, it's that pie in the sky type heaven, right? Sorry if I used you guys in the Jeremy Bearimy of it all.
So I'm now writing down, don't eat Brazil nuts because it takes away food from parrots. But I would not expect Jared to stop eating Brazil nuts because he doesn't have the same feeling. I mean, I don't think it's a sin if Jared eats Brazil nuts, because I don't think he has the same feelings about parrots as I do. But I don't know if that.
I don't think I've ever even had Brazil nuts, to be quite honest, so I couldn't tell you.
I found that part of hers interesting. Again, coming back to then maybe the question of putting Suchocki in conversation with like the biblical narrative. I find I feel like her way of talking about that you can be implicated in sin, but you're not really guilty of it unless you know and can actually make a different choice. I kind of connect it to that idea of like, it's not really sin until you eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, right? Like before you've eaten from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, you are doing stuff, but it's not necessarily sin. And when you do, well, then like there's a sense in which it's a fall because you realize you're guilty or you realize that you can be guilty, and you often do end up being guilty, but it's also like the way towards a reality in which you're not doing that violence is maybe not going to happen anymore because it creates the possibility of moving towards a new way of living that doesn't include that unnecessary violence. I don't know if anyone has thoughts about that, or I can move on to my next question that was in my discussion starter too. But anyone so I guess the general theme would be any thoughts around how it relates to how you read the biblical narrative about the fall or the problem of sin, any resonances.
I think it's helpful for us to try to reflect upon, I think each of you, it's helpful for you to reflect upon how you understand sin, and that may include how you interpret the biblical story in the Garden of Eden, or even the biblical references to it from Paul. We get from Williamson a clear understanding that in the Jewish tradition, Adam and Eve are not interpreted in the same way that Paul is interpreting them, and thus many Christians have interpreted them as that's sort of the origination of sin. So there are ways of thinking about sin. Jews still talk about sin and wanting to not sin, wanting to not do things that are considered wrong in some way or ethically problematic or harmful. But they don't necessarily talk about Adam and Eve. So there's a variety of different ways of thinking about it. That's all I'm saying. I'd be curious to hear from some of the folks who haven't spoken much, like Carrie and Chance. And I know Dee Dee, you're having a hard time with the computer, but.
I find it interesting where the conversation went. I'm preparing after this class to go sit in a tree stand with a bow and arrow, and I hope to shoot a deer to put food on my family's plate. And so to hear this, I was like, oh gosh, I get to think about this the whole time I'm sitting there. I'm grateful for that. But this violence piece just continues to pop its head up in my semester, and we got towards animals, and I think Grace was kind of going this direction, but this violence, and what do we get to clarify as violence towards one another, and then this necessary violence. I can't help but think about I was in St. Louis a couple months ago and looking at some of the remains, I don't know what to call them, some of the what the Ferguson riots have still left in that town, and seeing that and hearing the arguments from my conservative congregation of that was the biggest disaster in the past 5 years, and then hearing the other side of it from members of a church in St. Louis saying that was one of the best things that could have happened to our town in the past 5 years. That was a necessary act of violence. And so I can't say I've decided. Writing the paper is where a lot of this decision making, discerning happens for me. And so I'm still wrestling through, is violence ever necessary from human to human? If we get too far into the animal world, for me, I get lost. I can't see a way we could possibly eat and survive without. So that's kind of where I'm at, and I appreciate being able to listen a lot and compile my thoughts. So, but I thank you for asking me to speak.
Well, and just to clarify, so Suchocki is not saying that you needing to or choosing to hunt a deer and then to eat it, and your family to eat it. She's not talking about that as violence in the sense of sin. She's talking about violence as this sin is more like violence that doesn't have to be done for you to eat and survive and be well. So violence does happen that is just necessary. So she's not making that the direct connection. And then
I
yeah.
recognize that, and I think the part where I get to wrestle with is kind of like what Reagan said. What is necessary and unnecessary? Like, who gets to be the judge of that?
Well, you do, right? I mean,
Yeah.
In some ways you do, or maybe your community does, and conversation, maybe your family, and conversations about, would you have a conversation and say, so what do you all think about me hunting and killing deer that are overpopulated? There's an overpopulation of them, or going to the store and participating in the industry that kind of treats animals very poorly. I mean, so those are different questions, though. So the other thing that I just wanted to note or to highlight, and I really should not be talking because this isn't my discussion starter, but I simply want to confirm that there are various ways of thinking about sin. And this is just one constructive way of thinking about it. You may decide you want to think about sin in a different way. Maybe you like Wesley's view of sin. Maybe you like the Niebuhr's way of thinking about sin, or something else. So it just raises the questions, I guess. It sounded like Dee Dee had her hand up.
Reagan, do you mind if Dee Dee speaks since she hasn't gotten a chance?
Not at all. Not at all. Not at all.
I appreciate it. Hopefully you all can hear me. Okay. I echo a lot of what Chance and Reagan shared in the chat as well, and just throughout the class. This was an interesting perspective and a new one for me regarding this whole perspective of sin and violence as violence. So very intriguing, very unique for me. And so just taking more time to process that, because I just never viewed it from that standpoint. But in the practical examples that have been shared, it does resonate with me, and just looking forward to exploring more of that. And I thought that Sarah Lynn, you did a great job with your discussion starter and breaking that down and just giving a really concise overview that was very, very helpful with processing this information. So again, I just never considered it from the author's perspective with it. So just needing that time to sit with it more and kind of explore that. But I definitely could identify, like, again, for example, when Reagan put, killing for sport versus killing for survival. A great example, like as I referenced Chance, when you brought up Ferguson. So just trying to process it through that lens of theology with the purpose of the class. So that's what I would offer.
I'm wrestling, and you have to excuse me. Sometimes I get stuck in the mud, and so help pull me out. But what Dr. Russell just said relative to Chance's example, and I think it was even mentioned earlier about what is sin or what is violence, and she said, and the response was, and I think Suchocki's saying the same thing, it's really up to that community, right, to decide what is necessary and what is unnecessary. And when I hear that, it really messes with my embedded theology, because there's no universality, if that's how you say it, with it. Because what's sin over here in my tradition has to be sin over there. What's sin over there has to be sin over here. And with this perspective, with this approach, it's really kind of arbitrary, because what's sin over here might not be sin over there. And so I'm grappling with that in this conversation. I appreciate it because while on one hand, I get it that what's sin here might not be sin there, but what kind of slope does that put us on? Again, who gets to say then, is it sin or is it not?
Zach, did you want to say something?
Yeah, if I can get my mute to work. Yeah, the conversation about violence, necessary, unnecessary, especially when it comes to animals, I'd love it. I'd love to be able to say, yeah, there's a place where no violence can ever happen anywhere, but it's doesn't seem to be constitute to, reality. And I like burgers, so I mean, at some point you have to kind of make an allowance, but I keep coming back to the idea. I keep coming back to the scene in Exodus where God gives Israel manna and quail, and you go out and you get what you need for the day. It's only when you bring back more than you can use in the day that things turn rotten. And I think that that's where violence turns into the unnecessariness, where we take more than we need. And so the scenes in Dances with Wolves, I might be dating myself on this, but where the tribe goes out and they hunt the buffalo and they take what they can carry back, they take what they need, they use all of it. And the night before they got themselves pumped up, they prayed, they danced, they sang, they did all the stuff. And because it was more of like a sacred movement other than a movement of economic growth or things like that. So that scene versus later on in the movie when they're moving through the land and they come across the buffalo skinners, what they left, and was just miles of dead animals just sitting there rotting in the sun. And I think with the Lakota, that's the necessary violence of survival versus the unnecessary violence of the buffalo hunters taking just the skin. It comes back to this: take what you need for the day, give us this day our daily bread, and nothing and nothing further. And so I think that's kind of where I'm at with this necessary versus unnecessary violence. It's when, capitalism, right? Yeah, because I don't think I do violence if I go to the butcher shop and buy, meat that I'm going to use, take home, cook on the grill, and that's it. When I do violence to it is when I take more than I can use and I just let it rot in my fridge. Because then that animal died for nothing. And so when we do that kind of thing, I think that's where the unnecessary violence comes in. I do go to the eschatological idea that things will be better when God has fulfilled everything. And I know that's not the shared perspective of everyone, but I think there is a worth in looking at that end goal of everything being well. We've got to go through a lot of hell before we get to heaven. I think that's where I'm at with that.
I appreciate that, bringing that up. I often think of like spiritual practices, especially around asceticism, as like as kind of like opportunities to discern what you really need, because we often think we need more than we do, or we feel like we need more. And so I think part of how Suchocki talks about it is interesting because it's not sin until you realize that it's sin, right? But it's also things that we did in the past which we are implicated in, even when it was unconscious. She does say that. So like I can well, you're saying she says, I put it on my discussion starter too. She talks about unconscious. You can do something unconsciously, and it's sin when you realize that it's sin, and then you're directly guilty of something when you can make the choice not to do it. So I was thinking about it in terms of, but both recognizing something as sin and being able to recognize your guilt when you can make those choices are means of grace. So like work, like spiritual practices of fasting and things can help you recognize sin, identify sin in the sense of unnecessary violence because you're wasting something, maybe, or using more energy than you really need that causes harm or whatever. And it's a pain, asceticism is kind of a painful process, or fasting, but it actually is a means of grace because it helps you then move deeper into that vision of well-being. So anyway, I don't know that it's so totally, I guess I'm not sure if I think it's so subjective. Like, I don't know if what she's saying is that the community truly just like defines what is sin or not. I think it's, to me, how I understood it was more like, it's not, when it's recognized as sin, that is like a step forward towards the possibility of moving towards more well-being. And until you can recognize it as sin, it's not really, you can't really talk about it that way, you know? And until you can recognize something as sin and then then you have the possibility of recognizing when you're guilty, and then you have the possibility of forgiveness and transformation. But I still think there's something objective about it in the sense of, if it's unnecessarily doing harm to creation, it is objectively sin. It's just if we haven't become aware of it yet, we can't talk about it as such. So I'm just kind of responding to that issue around that subjectivity. It's not like the individual communities get to actually define what is harm or what isn't. It's like we become aware of something, we develop empathy, and that's God working through those communities to help us develop that awareness where we can see something as sin and then recognize our guilt.
Right. Yeah, I think going off what Sarah said, I think the correct way of thinking there is the universal objective principles at work here. And applying those same principles to different contexts will generate different norms for those contexts. But that's just because the different, facts of where somebody's at, what their resources are, what they're aware of, well, then using, again, these same universal principles that I think work for ethics in general will sometimes create contrasting recommendations depending on their situation, but that doesn't mean it's made up or that there is really no right or wrong answer here. It's rather just using the same principles, but in different contexts, it creates different answers.
I'm wondering if we can move on to the second question, just because I'm curious about people's thoughts and we only have 30 minutes left. So the second question I had was just thinking about Suchocki's solution to the problem of violence and anxiety around violence. She talks about God as truth, love, and beauty, and that being analogous to our memory of the event, our ability to have empathy for the victim or the perpetrator, or even ourselves, perhaps. And then beauty and imagination. So imagining a possible future in which there is well-being and beauty. And I'm wondering if anyone has thoughts around, as Christians or as people who are engaged in Christian theology, we might not all be Christians, what role do you think Jesus plays in this solution? So a lot of times when we have problem and solution within theology, Christian theology, we'll think about it in terms of the problem is this and Jesus is the solution because of this. So like to use a really simple example, if you have the view of sin as being a problem of sin causing death and anxiety around death, well, then maybe you'd have a Christus Victor model of Jesus, and death is, overcome by Jesus dying and rising again and liberating people from hell. So that's like a simple way of talking about that. But what is it? How do you see Jesus playing a role in Suchocki's solution? I'm curious if anyone has thoughts, or if you don't see Jesus playing a role, or how does Jesus play a role in your own mind if you're interacting with Suchocki's? I think any of those three would be interesting to hear from you guys. I admit it's a hard question because I wasn't sure myself when I asked it. Wasn't sure what I would say.
Could you just repeat it in short one more time for us, Sarah Lynn?
So the short end of the question is like, within Suchocki's understanding of sin as the fall to violence, and the problem being anxiety around violence, maybe causing then extraneous or needless violence. How, and then the solution being forgiveness, transformational forgiveness through God's calling us towards truth, love and beauty, or memory, empathy, and imagination. So that's her kind of problem solution. And I'm wondering, how do you think, did you see in Suchocki's, so there's kind of two questions. Did you see in Suchocki's work a way that Jesus played a role in that? Or can you imagine a way Jesus plays a role in that? Maybe she doesn't directly address it. Or the third option would be, maybe you think, well, I don't see how Jesus plays a role in this at all. I think those are kind of the three. I'm wondering what people's perspective is on those three kind of possible, I think, ways of engaging that.
I will give that a whirl, but I don't know how successful I'll be. It reminds me of what we're going to read with Park in Jesus's death. Is almost like, you know, it's it shows society, it shows the world, it shows existence. This is what unnecessary violence does. You know, our sin crucifies God, you know, without cause or you know, being brought up on trumped up charges. You know, that's what violence in the end will get us, with existence, or, you know, humanity crucifying, killing God. And so I think this understanding of violence through, you know, what Suchocki was talking about kind of speaks to that. I think taking the teaching of Jesus seriously is a big part of how we move into, you know, this willing of well-being for others, especially, you know, those that have sinned against us. And so there's this understanding of the sinned and sinned against, and taking that seriously, and understanding that reconciliation doesn't always look like a one-on-one thing. But I think the teachings of Jesus that sometimes get put on the back burner in churches, I think that plays a central role in allowing us to move in that direction. And I can't remember what your other question was.
No, I think you answered that question. I mean, I think it's interesting to say that what I heard you saying is that perhaps Jesus's crucifixion could help engender empathy, to see, you know, to see kind of the evil of violence more directly or fully. Is that kind of what you were getting at?
Yeah, it's like a condemnation of our sin. Like, this is what sin gets you, you know, eventually. You know, the culmination of sin's action in the world. This is what it leads to: killing your creator, creation killing their creator. So, but I'll let others jump in here because I'm running out of words.
I'm wondering if Suchocki, because Suchocki does talk about, like Dr. Russell said in the chat, it's clearly God's work, but I'm wondering if Suchocki's choosing not to talk about Jesus, the like account of Jesus's historical life and death and resurrection, because she wants it to be more of a universal way of thinking about, you know, rather than a particularly Christian way. A more universal way of thinking about the problem and solution.
I mean, that could be part of it. Oh, sorry.
I was saying the same thing as you, Jared. Yep.
Okay, yeah, I could see. I think that's part of it. I was going to say probably another way you can envision it, especially if you're taking kind of the moral exemplar theory of atonement, is that in a sense Jesus sows the, you know, if the way of Adam is the way of sin and death, then Jesus shows us what the way of life looks like in his particular life, rather than just a sense, a set of high ideals. His life, his death, and his resurrection all show us the way to life that we should follow. That I think that would be one of the ways Suchocki could be easily used if she wouldn't use it herself that way. So yeah, I mean, that makes sense. Does that kind of go towards it?
Yeah, I mean, there's not an answer to my question. It's more like
Right.
your perspective as if you are thinking about Jesus as being salvific in your life and putting that in conversation with Suchocki, how would you understand Jesus's role in this problem and solution? So I don't think there's a right answer to my question.
If you think about sin as being harming creation, and we can leave aside the part of whether it's necessary or not necessary for now, but wouldn't Jesus's statement that we should love our neighbors as we love ourselves fit in with that pretty well, and connecting with the idea of empathy, because if you really are going to treat others the way you want to be treated, then that would be a way of not only avoiding harm, but it would be willing their well-being, which is part of that forgiveness piece also, right? And then if you want to expand neighbor to include the rest of creation, so you could put animals in there if you want to, that could be a way of seeing Jesus as suggesting that we individually and as a community think about how to do the right thing, basically. That it's kind of a guide maybe for how to do the right thing. And this links back to when we were saying who gets to decide, what is okay and not okay. One potential answer to that is, if I wouldn't want somebody to do that to me, then probably I oughtn't to do that to someone else. Not that that's completely objective either, but perhaps helpful.
So Suchocki does end up talking about Christology and salvation in other books. She just doesn't talk about it in this book. And so if you're curious about it, wanting to see how it gets developed, the incarnation is particularly important, noting the presence of God that is with us in every moment, transforming our inadequacies, so that things turn out better than they would have turned out without God, of course, but there's no way to not have God. But so you can think about that as you read the other texts that she's written about Christology as well.
One thought that I had, because I saw her talking a lot about I think some of the violence her discussion about violence kind of is in line with the idea that hurt people hurt other people. So if you're socialized into accepting violence or thinking that it's natural and normal to do violence, then you will harm others as well. And so her idea that forgiveness through God's transformational lure towards truth and beauty and empathy or love, I kind of was thinking about it thinking about this idea that God maybe in Jesus kind of shows or teaches us not to deal with harm through this like punitive ways of dealing with it, like through harming back. That Jesus teaches us and shows us a model where even when God was harmed, God's response is transformational reality and forgiveness and a new possibility towards something beautiful in the resurrection. Was one thing that I was thinking about that kind of representing. I know I don't think that's Suchocki's view necessarily, because she writes about it differently in the book that we read for Gateway to Theology. She uses more of an exemplar perspective and more of like, yeah, that idea that God kind of like creates new possibilities by entering into the world that were not there before.
And invites us to, I mean, so Christ is as a moral exemplar is also a little Kantian notion there, that Christ is showing us to when harm is done to us, forgiveness is the response. It's a transcending response rather than violating back, which is a natural response. So the moral exemplar is not just Jesus doing moral things, but a moral exemplar of how Jesus responds to being violated as well.
Does anyone else have any other thoughts about this, or want me to make up another question, or want to ask a question, or want us to get out 15 minutes early, or want me to turn it over to Dr. Russell? I could do any of those things.
I think it was a good discussion, honestly, Sarah Lynn. I think it just is a reminder of how, I'm used two words, how sensitive and how arbitrary religion and theology can be, and just how we have to be open to other people's perspectives, their beliefs, and their practices. Just listening to the conversation, that's a major takeaway. of not taken away from the educational value of the academic value of it, but because it can be so fluid, depending on where you are and who you are. I think it should create within us a greater sensitivity of what we're dealing with and who we're dealing with.
And Sarah Lynn, I will continue to think about your Christology question, because like when I read this last night, I was like, that's a really good question. I'll see if I come up with something by the time we get there. And I did not. So no, I didn't want to leave you hanging during your discussion starter, but it's just such a good question and I'm still thinking. Yeah, thank you for the questions you posed.
I echo that as well, Sarah Lynn. Thank you for the questions you lifted. Part 3, as I mentioned in the chat, and hopefully you all can still hear me, resonated well with me in context of that social institute and society. That definitely resonated from the standpoint of a cultural context and just trauma and how that's processed. And when we speak of violence and the value of human life, particularly in the Black church context, and how we've been, I think, prone to how to process that, and through that lens of forgiveness, when you're being violated, because you're viewed as less than human. And then again, through these social constructs and society and socialization and so forth. So thank you for being deliberate to lift that up in your discussion starter, because that definitely resonated with me, and then redirects me back to your questions that you listed of how do we see Jesus in that. So thank you for that. Oh, I'm sorry. I would add not just how we see Jesus in it, but how Jesus would want us to respond in it when you look at that from a historical timeline. When it comes to, again, that context that I referenced, and then just my own embedded theology. So thank you again.
So I want to reiterate, I appreciate everybody enjoying and appreciating Sarah's helpful, very helpful and clear summary of Suchocki's points in her book here. And I also wanted to remind you or invite you to just think about how you do understand sin. This is a constructive way of thinking. I mean, a way of thinking about the theology of sin in a constructive way. Noticing what's going on in the world. There's a lot of violence. That's a problem. How do we understand that in relation to sin? So one way of interpreting violence is that it's, to go in a more classical Christian view, is that it's disobeying God's rules, or it's rebelling against God and what God wants us to do or be. But Suchocki here is inviting us to think about violence and sin together in these different contexts, and how we can think about violence theologically, and how we can think about sin in practical ways that are engaging our everyday life. All you have to do is turn on the news if you don't experience violence in your individual lives. So I'm happy that we get to read this, and I really do. While I don't necessarily agree with everything that Suchocki says in this book, I find it very helpful to set up both the structure of how you think theologically in a constructive theology, right? Perspective on how if you look at the first chapter again, or the first introduction, how she does that very clearly in an organized way, but also to help us reflect upon what it is we think of as sin. I think sin often has become something that we have had an embedded assumption about what is sin, often not even thought about critically. Maybe it's something like, not obeying your parents from when you're a child, thinking of that as sin, or sneaking chocolate after or before dinner, or as we develop and grow, we start to recognize, oh, there's sin of violating relationships, lying to your parents, or hurting a friend, or cheating on a test, or chocolate after dinner. Yeah, chocolate. I was saying chocolate before dinner would be, yeah. I mean, I would get in trouble if I ate chocolate before dinner. Like, you're gonna spoil your appetite. You won't eat your peas. Like, anyway, but just thinking about how different ways of thinking about sin and recognizing that different ways of understanding sin is an important reflection for your systematic theology. It's important to how we understand what Jesus is doing. Why is Jesus there? What's Jesus help us do? Perhaps Jesus is all about sin. Perhaps Jesus is all about something else. Some theologians would put Jesus as the answer to sin. Some theologians would put Jesus as the answer to God's expression of love for us, wanting to make sure we understand it more clearly, more intimately, more internally in a way. Zach has been eating chocolate the whole time. Uh-oh. Yeah, I maybe need to go get some chocolate. Any other questions for what we're going to do for next week? I see, Zach. I know you were trying to pretend like you weren't eating chocolate. I saw that.
Y'all got to jump on the Hershey train. I don't know what to tell you.
When I would study, I would have a little, those little bars, right? You have a little bar here. You have to get to page 18 to get the first bar, and then you have to get to page 32 to get to the next bar. Yeah, that's the way I would do it.
It doesn't help that Halloween is next week, so it's just
Oh,
laying
yeah.
around right now.
Yeah, I bet.
Yeah. I got to eat it before the kids eat it, so I'm kind of actually keeping them honest. So.
Yeah, you're protecting the kids, man. That is a necessary, whatever, violent, evil.
Yeah, I guess
whatever.
you could call it
Yeah.
violence.
It's a
if I'm eating
necessary
their kids.
violation of the chocolate rules. Yeah.
Yeah, you protect the kids at all costs.
Yeah.
Yeah. Very
Right. So next time we're going to be talking about Jesus, and everybody knows which theory of atonement they've got to share. All right. Thank you so much, Sarah, for your very helpful discussion starter, the written down and in leading our discussion.
Thanks, guys. Have a good day.
You
You all
too.
too. Bye-bye.
See ya. Do you need me on for anything else, Dr. Russell?
Nope,
Okay.
not unless you do.
Nope. I'll see you next time.
Okay.